Yep.
Hello, my name is Anne-Marie Littenberg. I live in Burlington, Vermont. I first became interested in rug hooking. It's almost 30 years ago now. I was living in Hanover, New Hampshire. I worked for Dartmouth College, and I used to spend every other Friday on the road flying to all over the United States. And I would get home and I would be exhausted, and I often couldn't sleep. One Saturday morning, I was up watching television, and there was an infomercial. This is like at 5 a.m. because I had that post-travel wired thing happening. And it was an infomercial for a punch needle. And I became glued to that infomercial, and I thought, this is the most brilliant invention ever created on the planet. And I ordered the punch needle, and I became obsessed with it. It was an old Craftsman style punch needle. I went to the library and I took out books from the local library about rug hooking. And what I found was a book called by a woman named Gloria Krause, who was doing all sorts of alternative styles of rug creations using a punch needle. And she would use everything from glue to bits of metal. And she was really, really creative. And I got her book and I followed all of her instructions. I started to build these frames. I started to make these rug designs using this technique that she used. And I loved it. I was completely obsessed. I then moved to St. Louis, Missouri, and I continued to work on this style of punch needle rug hooking. And I didn't even know that there was a robust rug hooking community out there in St. Louis. I lived in St. Louis for 5 years creating rugs, and it wasn't until I moved to Burlington, Vermont, that I discovered that St. Louis had a really robust rug hooking community. People like Noel Heidbreder, who just a real leader in the world of rug hooking. So I'm in St. Louis, I'm making these rugs. I then moved to Burlington, Vermont, and I see that there's going to be a sheep and wool festival down in Stowe, Vermont. So I drive down to Stowe, and I meet a woman who is standing in front of a wall of the most beautiful hooked rugs I've ever seen in my life. In fact, I'd never seen so many hooked rugs before in my life. I didn't know there were so many people using loops through a backing to create rugs. And let me be clear, I know many people do, but I don't distinguish between punch hooking or traditional hooking. For me, they're both methods of making loops and a backing, and I practice both. And I practice both and respect both and love both. I met this woman. It turns out her name was Burma Cassidy. She was a member of the guild at the time. And we started to talk about fiber, and she said, oh, you have to come to our guild meeting. It's going to be like tomorrow. And I went to the guild meeting and I brought some pieces that I had created. And it was like this whole world opened up to me with an incredible community of people who were creating fiber art through the creation of rugs. And I just kind of, it took over everything. I became completely engrossed, completely obsessed. I made the most amazing friends. Now, at that time, my background had been working in finances for nonprofit. And it was my first or second guild meeting. And a woman named Patty Yoder was president at the time. And they were talking about getting the guild getting its nonprofit 501c3 status. She made some sort of report, and I'm a big mouth. And I opened up my mouth and said, well, I have a lot of experience in 501c3, and this is what you have to do. Boom, boom, boom. And she immediately recruited me to the board, and I became treasurer. There I am. All of a sudden, I'm just learning how to do traditional rug hooking, although I'd been doing punch needle rug hooking. And I went from the fat right into the fire with taking a leadership role at the guild because I was the treasurer. And then did I become vice president? Yeah, I think I became vice president, and I eventually became president. Anyway, so I was president of the guild. I got swallowed into the whole thing with shows. We were mounting these shows at the Shelburne Museum. I was getting more and more accomplished in my rug hooking. I had the most amazing mentors. I had people like Patty Yoder, Julie Marie Smith, Ray Harold, Diane Phillips. It was a really, really rich and creative time. And I did that for many years. The guild was kind of a complete obsession for me, and it kind of took over my life. And then some things happened in my personal life with health issues that I had to step back. And everything is fine now. Everything is fine. But, it was time for a new group to take over. But also during that time, I started to get invited to teach around the country. And so I spent a number of years teaching workshops throughout the United States, and also I taught a number in and around Vermont. And then I got invited by Rug Hooking magazine to start writing articles, and they asked if I would do a book. I agreed. I actually ended up doing 2 books for them. One is on hooked rug portraits and the other is on hooked rug landscape. Writing for Rug Hooking magazine is what led me to photography. Now, I photographed most of the rugs for the online exhibit that the Guild is so brilliantly mounting right now. And the way I learned the reason I learned how to do photography is because I found that the photos that I was seeing from professionals were really terrible. They were overexposed, they were poorly lit, they were poorly mounted. I just wasn't happy. So I spent a concentrated amount of time. I spent a fortune on equipment and classes, and I really learned how to photograph rugs. So that kind of led to almost sort of a new career in that I photograph a lot of rugs for people. I mean, I've done a number of traveling shows for people. People ask me to photograph their rugs for their celebration submissions. So for me, photography and rug hooking are integrally tied. There's a really important connection there for me. And I wouldn't have had one without the other, and they both give me enormous pleasure. Of course, the photography is no longer just about photographing rugs and fiber art. I also photograph other 2-dimensional art for people now. If people need paintings photographed for an online gallery or for a jury submission, they'll bring that to me too to shoot. I grew up in the world of fiber. My mom was a single mom with 6 kids, and she had a minimum wage job when I was a girl. And she would go into the hospital, do her minimum wage job, which got us all health insurance. And then she'd come home at night and she would sit at the sewing machine and sew until midnight to make ends meet. And she taught me how to sew. And my mother is an amazing seamstress. She learned from a woman in her village during World War II after her father was shot and killed in the war. And my mother used to people would book their weddings 2 years in advance for her to do them. And she would tailor suits. And we were poor as church mice, but I could tear out a picture from the New York Times and she could make it. And she taught me how to do that too. I'm not nearly as good a seamstress as she is, but fiber is an integral part of my entire life experience. And rug hooking was the venue that allowed me to transition from looking at fiber as something practical. I learned how to sew, and when I used to work in the nonprofit field, I was always in a suit and I always made my own clothes, and I was always doing those Vogue designer patterns. Nobody dresses like that anymore. I don't dress like that. It was practical. I couldn't afford to buy the clothes that I loved, and I really loved beautifully tailored clothes. But now comes rug hooking, and it allows me to use my love of fiber and my love for creating in an artistic expression rather than just a practical expression. So that's my story.